The silence was the first thing a man noticed, and the last thing he ever got used to. Out here on the high plains of the Wyoming Territory, the wind had scoured the world clean of most everything, including noise. It was a sprawling, empty canvas of sage and dry grass, painted in the muted browns and sun-bleached greens of a life lived close to the dirt. The sky was a merciless, unending blue. An ocean hung upside down, and on the far western edge of it all, the mountains clawed at the horizon like the jagged teeth of some great, sleeping beast. This was the world of Elias Thorne, and for 5 years, it had been a world of one. His ranch was a testament to solitude. The small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own 2 hands was meticulously clean, but the cleanliness itself was a kind of wound. The floorboards were scrubbed. The single tin plate and cup were washed and stacked. The wool blanket on his cot was folded with a soldier's precision. It was the tidiness of a man with too much time and not enough life to fill it. Every day was a rhythm of hard, punishing labor that should have been for a family, for a future. He mended fences that protected nothing but his own loneliness. He broke horses no one else would ever ride, and he worked the land until his muscles screamed for a rest he refused to give them. He worked to make himself too tired to think, too tired to remember. But the memories were always there, staked to the land just as surely as his cabin was. On a small rise overlooking the vast emptiness, a single, weathered wooden cross stood stark against the sky. It marked 2 graves, Sarah and Daniel, his wife and infant son, taken by the cholera in the space of a week, leaving behind a quiet so profound it had become a physical weight. Sometimes, when the wind died down, and an unnatural stillness fell over the plains, Elias felt he could hear the silence. It was the sound of a woman's laughter that would never echo in the cabin again, the sound of a child's cry that would never break the night. The silence was his ghost, and it was slowly killing him. It was this living death that had driven him to do a thing he never thought himself capable of. In a worn copy of the Cheyenne Daily Leader, tucked away among advertisements for patent medicines and barbed wire, he had found a small, discreet notice. An agent, it said, who facilitated the placement of women seeking new lives in the West. It was a clean, respectable-sounding phrase for a dirty, desperate business. For weeks. Elias had stared at the notice, the paper growing soft and frayed from the sweat of his hands. He was 40 years old, weathered and worn down, but he was not yet dead. He could not bear another winter alone. The silence had finally won. He would go to Cheyenne. The journey was 2 days of dust and jarring emptiness, the creak of his wagon wheels the only company. When he finally reached the town, it was a shock to the senses. Cheyenne was a raw, chaotic wound on the face of the plains, a hub of frantic energy where the westward dream collided with bitter reality. The air was a thick stew of trail dust, horse manure, sweat, and the sour tang of cheap whiskey that seemed to seep from the very walls of the saloons. The streets teemed with a restless mix of humanity, hopeful settlers with wide, naive eyes, rail-thin laborers with the hollowed-out look of men who worked for pennies, and predators of every stripe, their smiles too quick and their eyes too sharp. Elias found the agent's office tucked away in a narrow alley between a tannery and a laundry, the competing stinks doing little to improve the air. The man, Silas Croft, was precisely what Elias had expected and feared. He was a man made of slick surfaces, from his greased-back hair to his polished boots, which seemed impossibly clean in the grime of his surroundings. He looked at Elias not as a client, but as a piece of business, his eyes quickly taking in the worn denim, the calloused hands, the deep lines of sun and sorrow on his face, and making a swift calculation of his worth. The meeting took place in a grimy back room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and desperation. The transaction was as clinical and cold as a butcher selling a cut of meat. There were questions about his land, his finances, the nature of the arrangement he sought. Elias answered in clipped, single-word responses. a knot of shame tightening in his gut with every question. This was not the act of a man seeking a companion. It was the purchase of a human being, and the moral stain of it felt like it was seeping into his skin. "The fee is $100, Croft said, his tone dismissive, as if they were discussing the price of a horse. "For my services in making the introduction and finalizing the papers, cash. $100. It was a significant portion of his savings, money he had scraped together over years of selling his cattle. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. Without a word, he untied the drawstring and emptied the coins onto the scarred wooden desk. The mix of silver dollars and gold eagles landed with a heavy, final thud, the sound echoing in the small, sordid room. It was the sound of his dignity being spent. Croft counted the money with practiced speed, then swept it into a drawer. "Very well," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Wait here. I will fetch the girl." "The girl?" The word landed like a blow. Elias felt a wave of nausea. He stood and walked to the room's single dirty window, looking out at the muddy alley. His own reflection, a ghostly, unfamiliar stranger. What in God's name was he doing? The loneliness had made him mad. He heard the door open and turned. She stood there, just inside the room, with Silas Croft's hand resting proprietarily on her shoulder. She was standing by the window, looking out at the same dirty street he had just been staring at, but he knew she was not seeing it. She was seeing nothing at all. She was thin, almost fragile, and her skin was pale, as if she had not seen the sun in a long time. Her dress was made of a simple, gray calico, worn at the cuffs and collar but immaculately clean, a small island of order in the squalor of the town. Her most defining feature was her stillness. It was not a peaceful stillness, but a rigid, protective shell, something built carefully around a core of fierce, wounded pride. "This is Lillian Vance," Croft said, his voice slick with the satisfaction of a successful sale. "Lillian, this is Mr. Thorne. He's your husband now. Turn around and greet him." She did not move at first. Then, slowly, as if pulling herself up from some deep, dark place, she turned. Her eyes met his for a brief, searing moment. They were dark, the color of a stormy sky, and what he saw in them stopped his breath. He saw no fear, no subservience, no gratitude. He saw a terrifying, bottomless abyss of pain, and beneath it, a burning coal of defiance. She looked at him as if he were her jailer, her executioner, and in that instant, Elias felt a jolt of profound, sickening guilt. This woman was not a solution to his loneliness. She was a living, breathing soul he had just bartered for, a complication so immense he could not begin to comprehend it. The wagon journey back to the ranch was a long, torturous exercise in silence. The vast, empty landscape that Elias usually found a grim comfort in now seemed to mock him. Its emptiness a perfect mirror for the gulf that stretched between him and the woman on the seat beside him. The wooden bench was wide enough for three, yet they sat on opposite ends, the space between them charged with unspoken things. He tried, in his clumsy, quiet way, to bridge the gap. An hour into the ride, the sun beating down, he uncorked his canteen and offered it to her. "Water?" She flinched at the sound of his voice, then gave a short, curt nod. She took the canteen, drank sparingly, and handed it back, her fingers carefully avoiding his. Her lips, he noticed, were chapped and pale. Later, he pointed a calloused finger toward a distant herd of pronghorn, their white rumps flashing in the sun as they raced across the plains. "Antelope," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She glanced in the direction he pointed, her expression unchanging, and offered another stiff nod before turning her gaze back to the horizon. She sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, a statue of endurance. She was a woman encased in ice, and he was the man who had paid for her, a man now shackled by his own consuming shame. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak and groan of the wagon wheels and the plodding, steady hoofbeats of the two horses pulling them through the immense, unforgiving wilderness. Every mile that brought them closer to his home felt like a mile deeper into a mistake from which there was no return. They arrived late the next day, as the sun was bleeding across the western sky, setting the plains on fire with hues of orange and purple. To Elias, the sight of his small, lonely cabin was always a comfort, a sanctuary he had carved out of the wild. He pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at her, hoping to see some small sign of relief, of finding a haven at the end of a long journey. He saw only terror. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the distant horizon, now took in the isolation of the place. She saw the small cabin, the lonely barn, the endless expanse of empty land stretching in every direction. Her face, already pale, seemed to lose its last trace of color. To Elias, this was his fortress. To Lily, it was a cage at the edge of the world. He climbed down and went around to her side. "We're here," he said, his words sounding hollow and foolish. He offered a hand to help her down, but she ignored it, gathering her skirts and climbing down on her own, her movements stiff and guarded. He led her inside the cabin. The last of the daylight filtered through the two small windows, illuminating a room that was stark and functional. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, a dry sink, and his own narrow cot in the corner. He had scrubbed the place from top to bottom before he left, but he could not scrub away the emptiness. He could feel it himself, more acutely than ever with her standing there. It was the absence of Sarah's sewing basket by the fire, the missing cradle in the corner. It was a home where a woman and child had once lived and died, and their ghosts were a palpable presence in the room. "This will be your room," he said, gesturing to a small door he had built into the back wall. He opened it, revealing a space barely larger than a closet, furnished with only a narrow cot and a small wooden chest. "It is not much, but you will have your privacy." She looked into the small, dark room and said nothing. She walked past him, placed her small bundle of belongings on the cot, and then turned back to the main room, her stillness returning, her face an unreadable mask. The first week established the rhythm of their new life. A tense and unspoken dynamic played out in near total silence. They were two ghosts haunting the same small space, their paths crossing but never truly meeting. Lily threw herself into her duties with a grim, relentless efficiency that bordered on fury. She was up before the sun, stoking the fire, making coffee that was strong and bitter. She cooked, she cleaned, she scrubbed the floorboards until the wood was pale. She mended the tears in his work clothes with tiny, perfect stitches. Her labor was a form of self-punishment, a constant, frantic effort to prove her value, to earn her keep, and most of all, to keep her mind from turning to the horrors she had left behind. Elias, in turn, retreated to his own work. He spent his days on the range, riding the fence lines, tending to his small herd of cattle, finding a familiar, honest solace in the hardship of it. The burning in his muscles was a welcome distraction from the burning shame in his soul. He stayed out as long as he could, often returning only after the sun had set, drawn back by a hunger he could not ignore and a duty he could not shirk. Their meals were agonizing affairs. They sat at opposite ends of the small table, the food she had prepared between them. The only sounds were the clinking of a fork against a tin plate, the scrape of a chair, the sigh of the wind outside the cabin walls. The silence was a living thing, thick and heavy, pressing down on them. And every night, the unspoken arrangement of their sleeping hung in the air, a constant, glaring reminder of the unresolved nature of their contract. She would retreat to her small, dark room and close the door, and he would unroll his bedroll on the hard floorboards by the dying embers of the hearth, a sentinel guarding a house that no longer felt like his own. The tension, stretched taut for 7 long days, finally snapped. It happened on an evening when the wind had been particularly vicious, a relentless, soul-stealing gale that had howled across the plains all day, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the cabin walls. They had both worked to the point of exhaustion. Elias wrestling a new calf from its mother and Lily fighting to keep the dust and grit from invading her clean domain. They had just finished another silent, miserable supper. Elias was staring into the fire, lost in his thoughts. When she rose from her chair and came to stand before him, she did not stand too close, but close enough that he could see the fine tremor in her hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. He looked up at her. Her face was pale in the flickering firelight, her eyes dark pools of shadow. He had been waiting for this, in a way, waiting for the tears, the accusations, the anger. He was not prepared for the cold, brittle emptiness in her voice when she finally spoke. "You paid for me," she said. The words were not an accusation, but a flat statement of fact. Her voice was low and thin, stripped of all emotion, like a wire pulled too tight. "The terms were clear. Stop looking at me with pity. Stop pretending this is something it is not." Her eyes, which had seen too much and shed all the tears they had, locked onto his. They held a terrifying resolve, a decision made in the darkest corners of despair. "You paid for me," she repeated, her voice cracking for just a moment before it hardened again. "Now do it." Before Elias could process her words, could find a single thing to say, her trembling hands came up to the high collar of her gray dress. With jerky, deliberate movements, she began to unbutton it, one button, then another. Her actions were not an invitation, not an act of seduction. They were a challenge, a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to seize control of her own humiliation by initiating the act she believed was inevitable. It was a way to get it over with, to define their relationship on the only terms she now understood, as a transaction, a service rendered for a price paid. Elias remained rooted to the spot, his mind reeling, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The firelight flickered across her pale, determined face, illuminating the stark reality of what he had done. He had sought to buy a cure for his loneliness, and instead, he had bought this. He was now forced to confront the true, terrible, human cost of his purchase. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of embers onto the stone hearth, each pop and hiss a sharp sound in the loaded silence. Elias looked at the pale column of her throat, at the small, trembling hollow where her second button had come undone, and he did not move toward her. He saw past the brittle challenge in her eyes, past the self-destructive demand, and into the profound, desolate pain that lay beneath. It was the pain of a cornered animal, one that would rather throw itself onto the spear than endure another moment of waiting for the blow to fall. He was shaken, not by her forwardness, but by the utter, soul-deep despair that must have driven her to this. She was trying to tear down what little was left of herself before someone else could. Slowly, as if not to spook a wild thing, he raised his hands. He did not reach for her waist, or her shoulders, or any part of the body she was offering like a sacrifice. He reached for her hands, the ones that were fumbling with the third button of her dress. His own hands were large, calloused, and scarred from a life of hard labor, and when they gently covered her smaller, trembling ones, the contact was startlingly warm. He stilled her fingers, his touch a quiet but absolute refusal. He felt a tremor run through her. He looked into her eyes and spoke, his voice rough with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel, let alone show, in years. "I paid for a wife," he said. The words scraped raw from his throat. "Not for that. This is your home now. Lillian, nothing will happen in it that you do not choose." The words hung in the air between them, simple and direct, yet carrying the weight of a world-altering promise. He then let go of her hands and stepped back, deliberately creating a space of safety around her, a circle of air that was hers and hers alone. Without another word, he turned, picked up his bedroll and the single worn blanket from his own cot, and walked to the hearth. He turned his back to her, giving her the dignity of privacy, and settled himself on the hard floorboards for the night. He did not look at her again. He listened. He heard the ragged intake of her breath, a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He heard the faint rustle of her dress as she slowly, mechanically, did up the buttons she had just undone. He heard her stand frozen in the middle of the room for a long time, the silence stretching out until it was thin and fragile. Finally, he heard the soft, hesitant footsteps as she retreated to her small room, and the quiet click of her door shutting. Lillian stood in the darkness of her room, her back pressed against the rough wood of the door, her dress still fully buttoned to her chin. She was consumed by a bewildering storm of feeling. There was the hot, crawling shame of her desperate act, of having so misread the man and the situation. There was the vast, hollow relief of a fate she had thought certain, now inexplicably averted. And beneath it all, something she had not felt in so long she could barely recognize it, a tiny, terrifying flicker of hope, as fragile as a candle flame in a gale. He had refused to take what she offered. He had refused to let her degrade herself. In his quiet, simple way, he had shown her the most profound act of respect she had ever known, and she had no idea what to do with it. The following morning, a new, unspoken agreement was forged in the ashes of the night's confrontation. The silence at the breakfast table was different. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of strangers, but a lighter, more watchful quiet of two people who had seen a glimpse of the other's soul and were now carefully measuring their steps. Elias drank his coffee, his gaze fixed on the table. Before he finally spoke, he did not look at her, but addressed the room, his voice calm and steady. "The world outside this cabin will know you as Mrs. Thorne," he began, outlining the terms of their new arrangement. "My wife, this house, everything in it, is your domain. You will run it as you see fit. The land, the livestock, that is my domain. We will be partners in the venture of keeping this place going, of surviving." He paused, and then he raised his eyes to meet hers. The next words were the most important. "Your room is your own. The marriage bed. That is a decision that is yours and yours alone to make. I will not touch you again unless you invite it. I cede all power to you in that. Do you agree to these terms?" It was a revolutionary concept. For a woman who had been treated as property, who had had every last scrap of her agency stripped away, the idea of being given such absolute power was staggering. It was a kindness so unexpected it felt like a trick. She searched his face for any sign of deceit, for the hidden hook in his offer, but she found only a weary sincerity in his gray eyes. She did not trust it. Not yet. Kindness, in her experience, was merely a different kind of trap. But for now, it was a reprieve. It was a space to breathe. "I agree," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. And so their life began anew. The days that followed were still quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was less of an abyss and more of a space, one where fragments of their broken pasts began to surface. Not in conversations, but in quiet, unguarded moments that spoke more loudly than words ever could. One afternoon, Lily looked out the cabin window and saw Elias standing on the small hill, his hat in his hands, staring down at the weathered cross. He stood there for a long time, a solitary, unmoving figure against the vast sky, and she saw on his weathered face a mask of such old, deep-seated grief that it made her own heart ache. She knew, without being told, that a piece of his soul was buried in that ground. Her own ghosts came for her in the night, more than once. Elias was jolted from his light slumber by the hearth by a sound from her room. It was not a simple cry, but a guttural, terrifying noise, the sound of a soul being ripped apart. He would lie awake on his bedroll, his muscles tense, listening to her muffled struggles against a nightmare he could not see. His heart would ache with a fierce, protective instinct he thought had died with his family. He wanted to go to her, to offer some comfort, But he held back, bound by the promise he had made. One evening, as he was stacking firewood by the hearth, a heavy log slipped from his grasp and crashed onto the stone floor with a loud, sharp bang that echoed like a gunshot. Lily, who was kneading dough at the table, dropped the bowl with a cry. The bowl shattered, but she did not seem to notice. She was frozen in place, her hands flying up to cover her ears, her eyes wide with a pure, animal panic. It was a terror that had nothing to do with a piece of falling wood. It was a memory, sharp and violent, that had been triggered by the sound. Elias saw it, and in that moment, he glimpsed the shape of the horrors she had endured. Through those cracks in their carefully constructed exteriors, they began to see the true nature of each other's wounds. As the days shortened, autumn tightened its grip on the high plains. The wind carried a new, sharp bite, a promise of the brutal cold to come. The vibrant greens of the short summer faded to somber yellows and browns, the whole world seeming to brace itself for a long siege. The coming winter was a tangible threat, a shared enemy that gave them a shared purpose, their partnership. Once just a set of spoken terms, now became a living, breathing thing, a daily dance of mutual effort. Elias spent his days preparing for the cold. He climbed onto the barn roof, replacing shingles the wind had torn loose, his hammer echoing in the crisp air. He took his axe to the stand of cottonwoods down by the creek, and the mountain of firewood he chopped and stacked against the cabin wall grew higher and higher. He took his rifle and rode out onto the plains, returning with sage grouse or a deer slung over his saddle, methodically stocking their larder for the lean months ahead. Lily worked with the same tireless urgency inside the cabin. She had found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin where Sarah had once tried to grow a garden. With stubborn determination, she had tilled the hard soil and planted seeds she had bought with the last of her own few coins in Cheyenne. Now, she harvested the small, hardy vegetables, potatoes, onions, carrots, and spent her days preserving them, filling jars that lined the shelves like disciplined soldiers. She took out the heavy winter clothes Elias had stored in a trunk and meticulously mended every seam, patched every hole. She learned to read the sky, the shape of the clouds, the direction of the wind, learning the subtle signs of the changing weather. Their shared purpose became their language, a form of communication spoken more clearly than words. He would return from a hunt and find a brace of grouse on the cabin step, a silent offering. A few hours later, when he came in from the cold, his hands raw and his body aching, the cabin would be filled with the rich smell of a hot, nourishing stew. He repaired a loose handle on her favorite cast-iron pot. She left a fresh pot of hot coffee on the hearth for him when he came in from his pre-dawn chores. They were small gestures, but in the vast silence of their lives, they were everything. One night, the first truly freezing night of the season, a crisis provided a moment of unexpected connection. Elias owned only a few horses, and one of them, a gentle mare named Daisy, was heavy with foal. Sometime after midnight, he was awoken by sounds of distress from the barn. He pulled on his boots and coat and went out into the biting cold to find the mare in the throes of a difficult labor, sweating and struggling, her eyes wide with pain. For hours, Elias worked alone in the cold, dusty air of the lantern-lit barn. He was good with animals, his hands patient and sure, but the foal was turned wrong, and the mare was growing weaker. He gritted his teeth, his arms slick with sweat and birth fluid, and tried everything he knew, but it was not enough. He was losing them both. Finally, defeated and reluctant, he made a decision. He strode back to the cabin and knocked softly on Lily's door. "Lillian," he called, his voice low. "I need your help." The door opened a moment later. She was wrapped in a blanket, her long hair unbraided and falling over her shoulders. She took one look at his strained, grim face and nodded, asking no questions. She pulled on her boots and a heavy coat and followed him out to the barn. Together, they worked in the small pool of golden light cast by the lantern. He explained the problem in quiet, practical terms, And she listened, her face serious and focused. "We need to turn it," he said. "I cannot get enough leverage on my own. I need you to hold her steady, and when I tell you, push down on her flank. Hard." They moved into position. The air was thick with the smell of hay, manure, and the raw, metallic scent of new life. Their hands touched as they worked to reposition the foal inside the laboring mare. Her hands were small next to his, but they were strong and steady. They breathed in unison, their faces inches apart, their focus entirely on the fragile, struggling life in their hands. The world shrank to the circle of lantern light, to the sound of the mare's strained breathing and their own quiet murmurs of encouragement. At last, with a final, coordinated effort, the wet, trembling foal slid free and landed in the clean straw Elias had laid down. For a terrifying moment, it lay still. Then its head twitched. It gave a tiny, spluttering cough and took its first, shuddering breath. A wave of shared, profound relief washed over them. The mare, exhausted but alive, immediately began to lick her newborn clean. In the quiet aftermath, Elias and Lily stood back, watching the ancient miracle. They were both smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat, their bodies aching with exhaustion. But a kind of peace had settled over them. He looked at her face softened by the warm lantern light, and a genuine, unguarded smile touched his lips. She looked back at him, at the worry lines on his face smoothed away by relief, and she smiled back. It was the first time. The first blizzard of the season arrived without warning a few weeks later. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickly gray. The wind died to an eerie whisper, and then the world simply disappeared. It was a monstrous, swirling wall of white that descended upon the plains, a legendary storm that old men would speak of for years to come. The wind, which had been so quiet, returned with the shriek of a banshee, a physical force that battered the small cabin. The snow did not fall. It flew sideways, so thick and fast it erased the world beyond the cabin walls. For 4 days and nights, they were snowbound, trapped in the suffocating intimacy of the small cabin. The vast, familiar silence of the plains was gone, replaced by the relentless, terrifying roar of the storm. The wind howled and screamed, and the cabin groaned under the accumulating weight of the snow. Drifts piled up against the walls, covering the windows, plunging them into a dim, perpetual twilight. On the third night, at the height of the blizzard, the ferocity of the storm seemed to find a way inside Lily's mind. The ceaseless, violent howling of the wind triggered her deepest traumas. Elias, sitting by the fire, watched as she began to unravel. She pressed her hands over her ears, but it did no good. She began to tremble, then to shake uncontrollably. Finally, she slid from her chair and curled into a tight ball on the floor near the hearth, her arms wrapped around her head, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the weather. Seeing her like that, so completely broken by a terror he could not fight for her, Elias abandoned his own stoic pretense. The distance he had so carefully maintained between them no longer mattered. Her pain was a greater force than his promises. He stood up, and with 2 strides, he crossed the room and picked up his bedroll. He brought it over and placed it on the floor near where she lay shaking. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply sat down on the bedroll beside her, his back against the wall, a solid, silent presence. He just sat with her in the raging dark, a bulwark against both the storm that raged outside their tiny sanctuary and the one that was tearing her apart from the inside. She did not acknowledge him, but after a long while, her trembling began to subside. In that moment of shared, silent vulnerability, as the blizzard howled around them, the foundation of their relationship shifted from a partnership of survival to the fragile, uncertain beginnings of a true human connection. The morning the blizzard broke was like the first day of a new creation. A profound, unearthly silence had fallen. The roar of the wind replaced by a stillness so complete it felt sacred. Elias pushed open the cabin door and was met by a solid wall of white. The world had been transformed, entombed in a thick blanket of snow that had buried fences, erased trails, and smoothed the harsh lines of the land into soft, rolling curves. The sun, when it finally rose, was a blinding eye in a pale blue sky, and it set the snow-covered plains alight with 1,000,000 glittering diamonds. It was a beauty so pure it was deadly, a pristine white desert that could freeze a man solid in his tracks. It took Elias the entire day of back-breaking labor to tunnel a path out from the cabin. The snow was packed as hard as stone in some places, light and deep as powder in others. He shoveled until his shoulders screamed and his lungs burned with the frigid air. Lily worked right alongside him. She had found a small coal shovel, and with a grim determination that matched his own, she scooped and threw snow, her face growing raw and red from the wind and the relentless glare. They did not speak, but moved in a shared rhythm of exhaustion and resolve. The shared struggle to reclaim their small world from the suffocating white, to dig their way back into the light, solidified the fragile bond that had formed between them in the howling dark. Their first act upon breaking free was to fight their way to the barn and the lean-to where the cattle huddled. Their hearts sank at what they found. The storm had been too much for some. They found 3 of their small herd frozen solid, their bodies half buried in massive drifts, statues of ice caught in their final, desperate moments of seeking shelter. The loss was a devastating blow. Those cattle represented months of hard work, the core of their precarious finances, their hope for a slightly less lean year. Elias stood over the frozen animals, his jaw tight, his breath pluming in the cold air. In front of Lily, he showed only a grim, stoic resolve, his expression hardening as he calculated the cost of the loss. But she saw past the mask. She saw the deep, gutting pain in his eyes, the flicker of defeat he tried so hard to conceal. And for the first time since she had arrived in this desolate place, she felt a sharp, unbidden pang not of pity, but of shared ownership. It was not just his loss. It was theirs. The enforced isolation of the long winter that followed did what no amount of conversation could have. Trapped together in the small cabin, with the snow piled high outside and the wind a constant, mournful song. The emotional frost between them began to thaw. The silence, which had once been a weapon and a wall, slowly transformed into a comfortable space. It was a quiet that no longer needed to be filled, and in that quiet, stories began to emerge. One evening, as Elias sat by the fire repairing a piece of broken tack, his hands moving with slow, practiced skill, he began to speak. His voice was low, hesitant at first, as if he were unearthing words that had been buried for a very long time. He spoke of Sarah. He did not speak of her death, not at first, but of her life. He talked about her laughter, how it had a way of filling every corner of the cabin, of chasing out the shadows. He talked about the way she loved the wildflowers that bloomed for a few brief weeks in the spring, how she would gather them in a tin cup to place on their small table. Then he spoke of Daniel, his son, a boy who had only lived long enough to take his first steps. Elias's voice grew thick as he described the unbearable quiet that had descended upon the cabin after the cholera took them both, a week apart, a silence so absolute it had a life of its own. "I was afraid of it," he confessed, his eyes fixed on the leather strap in his hands, unable to look at her. The quiet, it started to sound like my own grief. I reckoned if I had to listen to it for another winter, it would consume me entirely. I would just stop chopping the wood, stop feeding the stock, just sit and let the silence swallow me whole. That is why I sent for a wife, not just for companionship. I needed another voice, another sound, anything to prove I was still alive. His confession was a raw, painful offering, the laying bare of a wound he had carried alone for 5 long years. Lily sat perfectly still, her mending forgotten in her lap. She received his story not with words of comfort, which would have been useless, but with a reverent quiet, an unspoken understanding that honored the weight of his loss. A few nights later, the offering was returned. It was her turn. She sat across the hearth from him, her hands clasped tightly together, and began to speak of a life that felt as if it belonged to someone else, in another world. She told him about Philadelphia, about the smell of coal smoke and damp city streets. She spoke of a gentle, bookish father who was a university professor, and a loving mother who filled their tall, narrow house with the scent of baking bread and the sound of the piano. Her voice, chillingly detached, narrated the swift and brutal unraveling of that life, a financial panic that had wiped out their savings overnight, the shame and despair that had led her father to take his own life, the subsequent descent into a genteel poverty that was, in its own way, more cruel than outright destitution. She recounted answering an advertisement in an Eastern newspaper, a promising offer for a governess position for a wealthy family in the West. It had seemed like a deliverance, a chance to start over. "The man I met in Cheyenne," she said, her eyes looking through the cabin wall and into the past, "was the one who placed the advertisement. His name was Silas Croft. There was no family, no children who needed a governess. It was all a lie, a trap to get girls like me, girls with no money and no one to ask after them, out here where no one could hear them scream." She spoke of the establishment she was taken to, of the life she was forced into, with a calm, clinical voice, as if narrating a story she had read in a book. The detachment was her only shield, the only way she could speak of it at all. Elias listened without a single interruption. His face was carved in shadow by the firelight, his expression unreadable, but his hands, which had been still, slowly clenched into fists on his knees, his heart filled with a cold, protective rage so intense it was a physical sickness. He was a quiet, non-violent man by nature, but in that moment, he felt an overwhelming urge to find Silas Croft and tear him apart with his bare hands. When she finished, a profound silence settled in the room, but it was a silence of shared understanding, the sharing of these broken pieces of themselves, the jagged edges of their past lives, began to knit them together in a way neither of them could have ever expected. With the spring thaw, the world outside their small valley came back to life. The snow melted, the creek swelled to a rushing torrent, and the plains slowly greened. The thaw also meant their supplies were dwindling, necessitating a trip to the nearest town, a place called Redemption. Redemption was a microcosm of the West itself, a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place of both rough-hewn decency and sharp-edged prejudice. As Elias guided the wagon into town, Lily felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Word, she knew, traveled fast in this empty country. Gossip was one of the few currencies they had, and as they walked from the wagon toward the mercantile, she felt the truth of it. She felt the weight of hostile stares from men lounging on the boardwalk, and she heard the venom in the whispers of the town's respectable ladies, who pulled their children closer as she passed. She was an outcast, a walking, breathing symbol of sin in their small, pious community. Her first instinct was to fold in on herself, to lower her head and become invisible. But then she remembered the long winter, the blizzard, the quiet strength she had found in the man walking beside her. She remembered his quiet respect. She kept her chin up and her back straight. The prejudice found its voice inside the mercantile. Jebediah Kane was a boorish, arrogant rancher whose land bordered Elias's. He was a big man who had grown soft around the middle, his face perpetually flushed with whiskey and self-importance. He had long coveted a piece of Elias's land, the section with the year-round creek, and had always treated Elias with a sneering contempt. He was in the store, holding court with a couple of other ranchers, when Elias and Lily walked in. Kane's eyes landed on Lily, and a cruel smirk spread across his face. He spoke loud enough for the entire store to hear. Well, Thorne, I see you finally brought your $100 whore to town. You get your money's worth out of her this winter?" The air in the store froze. A bag of beans slipped from a woman's hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. Lily felt the blood drain from her face, the insult a physical blow that stole her breath. Before she could even process the humiliation, Elias moved. He did not move fast, but with the quiet, deadly economy of a predator. He crossed the space between them in 2 silent strides. There was no shouting, no posturing. He simply placed a hand flat on Cain's chest, stopping the man's next words cold. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously low, a gravelly rumble that somehow cut through the sudden silence more effectively than any yell. "This is Mrs. Lillian Thorne," he said, his gray eyes locked on Cain's. "She is my wife. You will either afford her that respect, or you and I will finish this outside." The deadly calm in his voice was more threatening than any punch he could have thrown. It held the promise of a violence that was absolute and final. Cain, a bully at his core, was not prepared for it. He saw something in Elias's eyes he had never seen before, a hard, unyielding glint of steel. He sputtered, his face turning a darker shade of red, and took a clumsy step back. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and finally just turned and stomped out of the store. Elias did not watch him go. He simply turned back to Lily, his expression softening as he looked at her. He had, in that moment, publicly and irrevocably claimed her. He had not defended his property. He had defended his wife. He had defended her honor at great personal risk, in front of the whole town. The wagon ride home was charged with a powerful, new emotional current. Lily sat beside him, the space between them no longer a chasm, but a vibrant, humming field of energy. She was reeling. He did not have to do that. He could have ignored Cain's taunt, could have pretended not to hear. It would have been the easier, safer thing to do. But he had not. He had chosen to stand for her. He had chosen her. That night, back in the cabin, the simple geography of the room felt different. The space between his bedroll by the fire and the door to her small room no longer seemed like miles of empty territory. It felt like a chasm they were finally ready to cross. The quiet desire that had been slowly, cautiously building between them over the long winter months was no longer just a physical wanting. It was now tangled with a profound gratitude, a deep and abiding respect, and a burgeoning affection that both frightened and thrilled her. It was Lily who acted first. He was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, the events of the day weighing on him. She came out of her room, her long, dark hair unbraided for the night, falling like a shawl over her shoulders. She crossed the room and knelt before him on the hearth. She said nothing. Words were not what was needed now. Without a word, she reached out and took his calloused, scarred hand in both of hers. It was the hand that had gently stopped her weeks ago, the hand that had held a rifle to feed them, the hand that had rested on another man's chest in her defense. Slowly, she brought his hand to her cheek, pressing his rough knuckles against her soft skin. It was a gesture of pure, vulnerable offering. It was a question, an answer, and an invitation, freely and completely given. Elias felt the press of his calloused hand against her soft skin, a universe of unspoken things passing between them in that single, reverent touch. He did not leave her kneeling at his feet. Gently, he took her by the arms and drew her up, until they were standing face to face in the warm, flickering light of the fire. He looked into her eyes, seeing not the ghosts of her past, but the woman who had stood beside him in a blizzard, who had smiled at him in a dusty barn, who had held her head high in the face of a town's scorn. The journey from the hearth to the marriage bed was only a few short steps, but it was a crossing into a new world. The consummation of their marriage was not an act of possession or a fulfillment of a contract. It was a quiet, sacred event, as solemn and as binding as any vow spoken before a preacher. It unfolded with a tenderness that was a balm to their scarred souls, a slow and patient discovery. His touch was filled with a sense of awe, as if he were handling something infinitely precious, something he feared he might break. Every movement was a question, every caress a reassurance. And for Lily, the tears that finally came were not of pain or shame, but of a profound, cathartic release. They were the tears of a woman who was, for the first time, not being taken from, but being met. Intimacy, which had been a weapon used against her, was transformed into an act of mutual healing. It was the physical manifestation of the trust they had so painstakingly built, the final, irrevocable sealing of their bond. In the quiet aftermath, they lay in the darkness. The fire burned down to glowing embers. He held her, his arm a solid, protective weight around her, and she rested her head in the hollow of his shoulder. The cabin, once a place of tense cohabitation, of ghosts and unspoken grief, finally felt like a shared home. His bedroll, still lying by the hearth, was a relic from a life that was now over. The following spring and summer unfolded in a season of precarious peace. A new, easier rhythm took hold of their life together, a rhythm of shared work and quiet companionship. Laughter, a sound that had never before been heard within the cabin walls, became a regular, if still surprising, occurrence. It was usually sparked by something small, a clumsy calf, a dropped tool, but its sound was a miracle, a sign of life returning to a place that had long been fallow. Elias, seeing the deep-seated fear that still lingered in her, took it upon himself to teach her how to shoot his rifle. He set up tin cans on a fence post and stood behind her, his hands gently guiding hers, showing her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. Her steady hand and keen eye surprised them both. She was a natural shot, and with every can she sent spinning into the air, a small piece of her fear was replaced by a quiet, steely confidence. She was no longer just a victim of the West. She was learning to survive in it on her own terms. She, in turn, brought a different kind of life to the ranch. She expanded her small vegetable garden, and beside it, she cultivated a patch of herbs, sage, thyme, rosemary. To Elias, who had lived for years on a diet of salted meat and beans, the new flavors she brought to their simple meals were a revelation. More than that, the small patch of green, a defiant splash of beauty against the harsh, brown landscape, was a testament to her own resilience. It was a piece of her, a piece of a gentler world, planted firmly in this unforgiving soil. They worked side by side, their shared labor a silent conversation. They rode the fence lines together, mended the breaks from the hard winter, and tended to the growing herd. He taught her how to read the brands on a cow, and she learned the names he had given to each of the horses. They were golden, idyllic days, where the sun was warm and the work was hard but honest, in the quiet of those long summer evenings. Sitting together on the cabin step, watching the sky turn from blue to purple, they allowed themselves to believe in the possibility of a simple, happy future, a life defined not by the broken pieces of their pasts, but by the whole, solid thing they were building together in the present. But their peace was fragile, an eggshell in a world of stone. The first cracks came from a familiar direction. Jebediah Cain, publicly humiliated and privately resentful, nursed his grudge like a sick child. His animosity began to manifest in small, petty acts of sabotage, impossible to prove but designed to wear Elias down. One morning, they woke to find a 20-foot section of their northern fence cut, the wire snipped clean. It took them the better part of a day to round up the half-dozen cattle that had strayed. A few weeks later, Elias went to the well for the morning's water and was met with a foul, sickening stench. He peered down into the darkness to see the bloated carcass of a coyote floating in their water supply. The act was one of pure, malicious spite. It took him 3 days of disgusting, back-breaking work to haul the animal out, drain the well, scrub the stone lining, and wait for it to fill again with clean water. Through it all, Elias's face was a grim mask, his anger a cold, banked fire. These incidents served as a constant, low-grade threat, a reminder that the world beyond their property line was not safe, and that an enemy was always watching. The true threat, however, did not come from the enemy they knew. It came like a ghost from a past Lily had thought was buried forever. It materialized in the dusty main street of redemption, in the person of Silas Croft. The Western grapevine was a twisted and efficient thing, and word had eventually reached Cheyenne that the damaged goods he had sold for $100 had somehow landed on her feet with a respectable rancher. The predatory Croft, seeing an opportunity, had come to collect what he saw as his due. His entire trade was built on the belief that men, especially men who valued their standing, would pay anything to keep a wife's shameful past a secret. It happened on a rare solo trip Lily had made to town for flour and salt. She was leaving the mercantile, her mind on the ride home, when a voice from the shadows of the boardwalk spoke her name. "Lillian, fancy seeing you here." The voice, slick and cruel, was a physical blow. It sucked the air from her lungs and sent a spike of ice-cold terror through her heart. She froze, her hand clutching the sack of flour. He stepped out of the shadows, looking just as he had in that grimy Cheyenne office. The same greasy hair, the same polished boots, the same predatory smirk. "You look well," he said, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her feel dirty. "Landed on your feet, it seems. A ranch, a husband, very respectable." He cornered her against the wall of the building, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper so no one else could hear. He detailed his demands. He had expenses. His silence had a price. He wanted money, a regular payment, delivered to him in town once a month. "You see, Lillian," he hissed, his face close to hers. "Your husband, Mr. Thorne. He seems like a proud man, a man with a reputation to protect. I imagine he would be very disappointed to learn the full details of how his lovely wife spent her time in Cheyenne. I wonder what those pious ladies in there would think. I could ride to every ranch in this county, tell them a story. I can be very persuasive." The threat was absolute. He would destroy the fragile life she and Elias had built. The whispers she currently endured would become a roaring fire of condemnation, one that would burn them both. The encounter left her shattered. She stumbled back to the wagon, her body trembling, the beautiful light of their summer of hope extinguished in an instant. She returned to the ranch a shell of the woman who had left that morning. She tried to hide it, to force a smile, to go about her evening chores as if nothing was wrong. She believed this was her burden to bear, her stain, and she could not let it poison the goodness Elias had shown her. But the easy intimacy that had grown between them, the comfortable silence, the shared laughter, it was all gone, replaced by a palpable fear that radiated from her like a chill. Elias saw it the moment he looked at her. He saw the haunted look in her eyes, the way she flinched when he came near her. That evening, after a tense, silent supper, he gently pressed her for the truth. "Lily," he said, his voice soft, "what happened in town?" She tried to deny it, to claim it was nothing, but his steady, concerned gaze broke through her defenses. It all came pouring out in a torrent of gasping sobs and broken words. A confession filled with a shame so deep she could barely speak. She told him everything, her face buried in her hands, expecting to see disgust and revulsion in his eyes when she was done. But what she saw was not disgust. Elias's reaction was a quiet, terrifying rage. His face seemed to change, the lines deepening, his expression hardening into a granite mask. His eyes, normally so calm and gray, turned as cold and hard as chips of flint. The love and tenderness he showed her was now focused outward, transformed into a deadly, protective fury. "Stay in the cabin," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Lock the door behind me. I will ride to town. I will deal with Croft." But Croft, impatient and arrogant, did not wait to be dealt with. That very evening, as dusk was settling over the plains, he rode out to the ranch. He had seen Elias's wagon leave town and foolishly assumed the rancher would be gone for hours. He had come with the intention of terrorizing Lily, of physically reminding her of the power he had once held over her, to ensure her compliance. Lily was standing by the hearth, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear for Elias and terror of what Croft might do. When the cabin door was thrown open, Croft stood there, silhouetted against the dying light, a cruel smile on his face. "We have unfinished business, my dear," he said, stepping inside. The confrontation was brutal and swift. He lunged for her, grabbing her by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. She cried out, struggling against him, but he was too strong, and at that exact moment, the door burst open again. It was Elias. He had been on his way to the barn when he had seen Croft's horse tied to the rail, and had charged back. He crossed the room in 2 bounds, a roar of pure rage erupting from his chest. He slammed into Croft, sending both men crashing into the table. A desperate, primal fight ensued. They grappled on the floor, fists flying, grunts and curses filling the small cabin. Elias was stronger, fueled by a righteous fury, and he quickly gained the upper hand. Croft, realizing he was losing, his face bloody, managed to squirm free. He scrambled backward and pulled a small, concealed pistol from his coat. He raised it, his hand shaking, and aimed it at Elias's chest. Time seemed to stop. Lily saw the gun, the wild look in Croft's eyes, the man she loved on his knees, defenseless, a pure, primal instinct, the same instinct that drives a mother bear to defend her cub, took over. She did not think, she acted. Her eyes darted to the stove, where the heavy cast-iron skillet from supper still sat. In one fluid motion, she snatched the skillet from the stovetop. It was heavy in her hand, a familiar tool turned into a desperate weapon. As Croft's finger tightened on the trigger, she swung it with all the strength in her body, bringing it down on the back of his head. There was a sickening thud of iron against bone. Croft's eyes went wide with shock, the gun firing into the floorboards as he collapsed like a felled tree. His head struck the sharp, unforgiving edge of the stone hearth with a final, sickening crack. A sudden, shocking silence filled the cabin, broken only by the ringing in Lily's ears and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Elias scrambled to his feet. They both stood there, panting, staring down at the still, twisted body of her tormentor. A dark pool of blood began to spread slowly across the floorboards of their home. Their season of peace was violently, irrevocably ended. The explosion of violence was followed by a silence so sudden and so absolute that it seemed to have a physical weight. The only sounds in the cabin were the ragged, hitching gasps of Lily's breath and the frantic, wild pounding of her own heart against her ribs. A frantic drumbeat in the tomb-like quiet. She stared, her eyes wide and unseeing, at the still, crumpled form on the floor. The heavy iron skillet had fallen from her nerveless fingers, landing on the floorboards with a dull, metallic clang that echoed unnaturally in the small space. Elias moved, his body reacting before his mind could fully grasp the horror. He scrambled to his feet and crossed to Croft in 2 quick strides. Kneeling beside the body, he pressed his fingers to the man's neck, searching for a pulse, for any sign of life. He found none. Croft's eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling beams of the home he had invaded. Elias gently closed them. He then turned to Lily. She was still standing in the same spot, frozen, a statue carved from shock. He went to her and, without a word, pulled her into his arms. Her body was rigid at first. Then she began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that racked her entire frame. He held her tight against his chest, his own heart hammering, his mind reeling. The act had been a clear and desperate defense of his life, a primal instinct to protect. But the reality of it was stark and brutal and undeniable. There was a dead man in their home. They had killed him. The small cabin, the sanctuary they had so carefully built together, had become a crime scene. Later, under the cold, indifferent light of a partial moon that cast long, skeletal shadows across the plains, Elias made a fateful decision. He stood over the body, which he had covered with a horse blanket, and thought through their options. There were none. They could not go to the law. He was not a fool. He knew exactly how the story would be twisted by a man like Jebediah Kane, the reclusive rancher and his bought wife, murdering a man in cold blood over some sordid disagreement from her past. Lily's history in Cheyenne, which Croft himself had threatened to expose, would become her conviction. Justice in the West was a fickle, often prejudiced thing, and it had little mercy for women with a past and men who stood by them. With a grim determination settling over him like a shroud, he knew what he had to do. He went to the supply shed and returned with a large, thick canvas tarp. He worked alone, wrapping Croft's body tightly, securing it with rope. He did not ask for Lily's help. She was still in a daze, moving like a sleepwalker, her eyes holding a vacant, shattered look. He led one of the horses from the barn, saddling it and then heaving the heavy, awkward bundle of the body over its back. He tied it down securely, his movements economical and sure, the practiced motions of a rancher now put to a grim and terrible purpose. He took the reins and began to walk, leading the horse away from the cabin, away from the small circle of light and life, and out into the vast, dark emptiness of his property. He led the horse for over a mile, to a remote, rocky arroyo at the far edge of his land, a place of stone and scrub brush where no one ever went, a place where the ground was hard and unforgiving. While Lily stood watch, a silent, ghost-like figure in the pale moonlight, Elias began to dig. The work was brutal. The dry, rocky soil fought him for every inch. He dug for hours, his shovel scraping against stone, the rhythmic sound of his labor the only thing breaking the immense silence of the night. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his shirt, but he did not stop, driven by a desperate urgency. The burial was a hurried, profane ritual. They rolled the canvas-wrapped body into the shallow grave, the sound of it landing a dull, final thud, as they pushed the last of the rocks and dirt over the makeshift tomb, scattering loose brush over the disturbed ground to hide their work. They both understood the truth of what they were doing. They were not just hiding a body. They were burying their hopes for a simple life, for the golden, peaceful summer that had been so violently stolen from them. They were shackling themselves to a terrible, shared secret, a weight that would bind them together far more grimly than any marriage vow. In the weeks that followed, the secret became a poison, seeping into every corner of their lives. A chasm of silence opened between them, wider and deeper than any they had known before. In the beginning, their silence had been born of strangeness and shame. Now, it was born of a shared guilt and a fear that was too great to be put into words. Lily was haunted. The ghost of Silas Croft was a constant presence in the cabin. She had nightmares that ripped her from sleep, screaming, her body drenched in a cold sweat. During the day, she was consumed by a frantic, restless energy. She scrubbed the cabin floorboards with a fury, concentrating on a single spot near the hearth, trying to erase a blood stain that existed only in her mind. The wood was scrubbed pale and raw, but to her, the stain was always there, a dark, indelible mark of what they had done. Elias watched her slow disintegration with a feeling of utter, gnawing helplessness. The woman who had taught him to laugh again, who had filled his home with the scent of herbs and life, was slipping away from him, retreating into a dark place where he could not follow. He tried to comfort her, to reach for her in the night, but his touch, which had once been a source of healing, now often made her flinch. It was a physical reminder of the violence they had committed together. Their intimacy, once so new and precious, was now tainted by the memory of that terrible night. They were bound together, sleeping in the same bed, living in the same small space. But they were more alone than ever. They were tied not by love, but by a shared guilt that felt like a heavy shroud, suffocating the life out of them. Their paranoia, already a constant low hum beneath the surface of their days, was amplified by the actions of Jebediah Kane. Kane was not a clever man, but he was malicious and observant. He had seen the slick stranger, Croft, in town, He had witnessed him asking pointed questions about the thorns, and now that same stranger had vanished from the face of the earth. Kane's resentful mind put the pieces together and arrived at a conclusion that was, for once, entirely correct. He lacked proof, but he had a weapon far more insidious: rumor. He began to subtly poison the well of public opinion in redemption. He would lean against the bar in the saloon, or stand outside the mercantile, and speak in a low, suggestive voice about the strange business between the Thorns and that fellow from Cheyenne. He would mention Croft's sudden, unexplained vanishing act, then trail off, letting others draw their own dark conclusions. The whispers that had once followed Lily, the whispers about her past, now followed them both, darker and more dangerous than before. Eventually, the rumors grew loud enough that they forced the hand of the local lawman. Sheriff Brody was a pragmatic, weary man in his late 50s, his face a roadmap of long, hard years spent trying to impose a fragile order on a lawless land. He had seen more than his share of Western justice and injustice, and it had left him with few illusions about human nature. One hot, dusty afternoon, he rode out to the Thorn Ranch. His arrival was a terrifying confirmation of their worst fears. They saw him coming from a long way off, a lone rider moving steadily across the plains, and a cold dread settled in the pit of their stomachs. The interview was excruciatingly tense. They stood on the porch of the cabin, the place where they had once sat and dreamed of a future. And now it felt like the defendant's dock. Elias was guarded and laconic, his face an unreadable mask. He answered Brody's questions with short, clipped sentences. Yes, a man named Croft had been to the ranch. He had come with a business proposition, some scheme about land speculation. Elias had not been interested. He had sent the man on his way. He had not seen him since. Lily stood beside him. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked pale and brittle, as if a strong wind might shatter her. Her eyes held a haunted, far-away look that Sheriff Brody, in his long career, had seen many times before. He recognized the look of people who were carrying a heavy secret, who had seen something they could never unsee. He knew they were lying. He could feel it, a sixth sense honed by years of dealing with liars, cheats, and killers. But he had no body. He had no evidence. He had nothing but the malicious rumors started by a known troublemaker like Jebediah Kane. He let his gaze drift over their property, his eyes sharp and calculating, as if searching for a patch of freshly turned earth. He found nothing. "Well," Brody said at last, his voice a dry drawl, "this Croft fellow seems to have vanished into thin air. Folks in town are talking. If you happen to remember anything else about his business proposition, you be sure to let me know." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that was not friendly. "I will be looking into the matter further." His departure left them in a heightened state of fear. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It had a name and a face. It was Sheriff Brody, and he was watching them. The strain of the sheriff's visit, piled on top of the weeks of guilt and fear, finally became too much for Lily. That night, she broke. The quiet, stoic control she had maintained for so long shattered into a million pieces. They were sitting in the near dark of the cabin, the silence between them thick and suffocating, when she began to weep. It was not a quiet crying, but a storm of deep, racking sobs that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul. In a fit of despair, she told Elias that she was a curse. "I bring nothing but darkness," she gasped, her voice choked with self-loathing. "My father, the shame I brought to my mother. And now you. I have brought death and ruin to your doorstep. Everything I touch turns to rot." She believed it with every fiber of her being. She believed that the only way to save him, the only way to atone for the poison she had brought into his life, was to remove herself from it. "I have to leave," she whispered, her voice desperate. "I will disappear. I will go east or west. It does not matter. I will vanish, just like him. Then you can tell the sheriff whatever you want. You can tell him I ran off, that I confessed to you and fled. You can be free of me, of this. It was the ultimate act of her self-hatred, the final, logical conclusion of a woman who had been taught by the world that she was worthless, that she was a stain. She truly believed that her absence was the greatest gift she could give to the man she had come to love. In that moment, with everything they had built on the verge of collapsing into dust, Elias finally found his voice. He crossed the room and grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip fierce but not violent, refusing to let her go, refusing to let her disappear into her own despair. He forced her to look at him, his face inches from hers in the dim light. "You listen to me," he said, his own voice raw and cracking with an emotion he had never fully expressed. "My life before you came here was not a life. It was a gray, silent tomb. I was a dead man walking. I was waiting for the silence to swallow me. You did not bring darkness into this house. Lily, you brought life. You were the first color, the first sound I had known in 5 years." A torrent of raw, unadorned words came pouring out of him. The confession of a man who had forgotten how to speak the language of the heart. "I love you," he said, the words feeling clumsy and powerful on his tongue. "Do you hear me? I love you, and I will not let you go." He pulled her against him, holding her tight. "They can come for us. Let the sheriff come. Let Cain say whatever he wants. I would rather hang with you than live 100 years without you. Do you understand that? There is no me without you. Not anymore." It was not a poetic declaration from a book. It was a stark, powerful statement of absolute commitment, forged in the brutal reality of their situation. His love did not erase their guilt. It did not hide the body in the arroyo or silence the whispers in town, but it transformed the secret from a poison that was killing them separately into a shared burden. It was a promise that whatever came for them, they would not face it alone. They would face it together. Elias's declaration of love did not magically erase their predicament, but it did relight a candle in the suffocating darkness of their fear. It transformed their shared guilt from a wall that divided them into a desperate, clinging bond. They were in this together, until the end, whatever that end might be. They did not have to wait long to find out. Jebediah Cain, empowered by the sheriff's visit and his own unshakable certainty, decided the time for whispers was over. The law was moving too slow for his liking. If Sheriff Brody would not find the proof he needed, then Cain would find it for him. He was convinced he knew where a man would hide a body on a ranch like Thorns, not near the cabin, not out on the open plains, but in a place of rocks and shadows, a place no one would ever have a reason to go. The arroyo. His greed and malice were a potent fuel, driving him to unearth the secret that would ruin Elias Thorne and finally deliver the coveted, water-rich piece of land into his hands. He waited for a moonless, starless night, a blanket of impenetrable black that was perfect for his grim work. With a shovel tied to his saddle, he rode from his own property, cutting across the plains and onto Thorne land, his horse's hooves muffled by the dry grass. He was a thief in the night, coming not to steal cattle, but to steal a man's life and future. But Elias had not known a single night of restful sleep since Sheriff Brody had ridden away. Vigilance had become his second skin. Every evening, he would stand outside the cabin, his eyes scanning the dark horizon, watching, waiting. From the low ridge behind his property, he had a clear view of the lamp burning in Cain's distant ranch house. And on this moonless night, he saw a lone rider leave that house and move not toward the town, but toward his own land. A cold certainty settled in his gut. He knew where Cain was going, and he knew why. He pulled on his boots and retrieved the rifle from its pegs on the wall. He looked at Lily, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low and calm. "Bar the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." He did not wait for a reply before slipping out into the darkness, moving with the quiet, swift purpose of a hunter. The confrontation at the shallow grave was not a clean, decisive shootout. It was a desperate, ugly struggle in the pitch dark. Elias came upon Cain just as the man's shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. It was the sound of a crime being unearthed. "Cain!" Elias's voice cut through the night, sharp and dangerous. Cain spun around with a startled cry, raising the shovel like a weapon. Elias was on him in an instant, tackling him to the ground. They rolled in the dirt and rocks, a grunting, cursing tangle of limbs. It was a fight born of desperation and hatred. As they grappled, Elias confronted him not just for this final, ghoulish act, but for the relentless, venomous campaign of hatred that had led them to this point. "Was it not enough?" Elias snarled, his hands closing around Cain's throat. "The fence, fouling my well, spreading your poison in town. You had to come and do this." Fueled by adrenaline and the terror of being caught, Cain's arrogance boiled over into a screaming, spitting rage. Cornered and exposed, he unwittingly blurted out a full confession. "You deserve it, Thorn!" he shrieked, his voice echoing unnaturally in the still night air. "You and that whore you brought here, this land, this water, it should have been mine, just like those cattle should have been mine." "What cattle?" Elias demanded, his grip tightening. "Miller's cattle!" Cain screamed, his self-control completely gone. "The ones everyone blamed on the Sioux, they were fine steers. Miller did not deserve them. No one deserves what they have. You take what you want in this world. Thorn! That is the only law." He admitted to everything, his justifications and his crimes spilling out into the darkness in a torrent of pure, undiluted malice. As his final words echoed away, a new voice spoke from the shadows, calm and steady. "Is that so, Cain?" A figure stepped out from behind a tall cluster of boulders, a rifle held loosely in his hands. It was Sheriff Brody, still deeply suspicious after his interview with the Thorns. He had decided to take a ride out and keep a quiet watch on the ranch himself. He had seen Cain's rider, and, like Elias, had followed. He had been standing in the shadows for the last 10 minutes. He had heard every single word. The entire dynamic of the situation shifted in an instant. Cain's face went slack with horror, the blood draining from it. The game was over. Brody looked from the desperate, panting men on the ground to the disturbed patch of earth beside them. He now understood the full context. The Thorns were not murderers hiding a crime. They were victims who had been systematically harassed and targeted by a vindictive, dangerous criminal. With Cain disarmed and his hands bound, his blustering rage replaced by a sullen, terrified silence, Sheriff Brody turned his full attention to Elias and Lily, who had disobeyed Elias's order and followed him. Unable to bear waiting alone in the cabin, the time for lies was over. Standing beside the desecrated grave of their tormentor, the canvas of the tarp now visible in the dirt, they told him the entire story. They spoke with a quiet, exhausted dignity, their voices low in the pre-dawn chill. They told him of Lily's past in Cheyenne, of Silas Croft's arrival, his extortion, and the final, violent confrontation in their home. They did not spare themselves or try to soften the brutal reality of what had happened. They fully expected to be arrested, to be taken to town alongside Cain, but they stood together, their hands clasped, ready to face the consequences as one. Brody listened without interruption, his expression unreadable in the dim light. When they had finished, he was silent for a long time. He looked from the disturbed grave to the pale, traumatized face of the woman and the fierce, protective love in the eyes of the man beside her. Brody had seen enough death and misery in his life to recognize true evil. He knew it lay in the cold, predatory hearts of men like Silas Croft and the petty, grasping souls of men like Jebediah Cain. It did not lie with their victims. In an act of profound, pragmatic justice, the kind that is rarely found in a courtroom, Brody made his decision. He looked pointedly at the shallow grave. "As far as I can see," he said, his voice a low drawl, "there is no body here, and without a body, there can be no murder to investigate. The case of the missing Silas Croft, if it ever was a case, is now officially closed." He turned his stern gaze on Elias. Jebediah Cain, however, will be tried for cattle rustling. I heard his confession with my own ears, but the court will want more. I expect you and your wife to provide a full and honest statement about his campaign of harassment against you. That is all." He paused, then added, his voice a little softer, "For your own good, you two should keep to your own affairs. Stay out of redemption for the foreseeable future. Let the talk die down." It was not forgiveness, but it was a form of grace, a second chance. He tipped the brim of his hat, turned without another word, and led his prisoner away, leaving Elias and Lily standing alone as the first fragile light of dawn began to break over the eastern plains. 2 years later, the seasons had turned, and a quiet, settled peace had taken root on the ranch. The cabin was no longer so small. A new room had been added on, built with Elias's own 2 hands, the fresh-hewn timber a testament to a future he had once believed he would never have. The cattle herd was larger, healthier, their brand a mark of hard-won prosperity. The shadow of the past had not vanished entirely. It never would. The rocky arroyo was still there, a place they never went. The memory of Silas Croft and the whispers of the town were scars on their shared history. But the shadow had receded. It was no longer a storm cloud threatening to burst over their heads, but a part of the distant landscape of their lives, a reminder of the darkness they had passed through together. On a warm summer evening, Lily knelt in her flourishing garden, her hands in the rich, dark earth. Her movements were calm and assured, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a deep, quiet strength. The garden was larger now, a vibrant tapestry of greens and yellows and reds, a defiant celebration of life in the heart of the wilderness. Elias rode in from the range, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. His face was still weathered by the sun and wind, but the deep lines of grief that had once been carved around his eyes had softened, smoothed away by years of quiet contentment. He swung down from his horse and was met halfway to the cabin by a small boy, perhaps a year old, who toddled on unsteady legs across the yard. The boy had his father's steady, serious gaze and his mother's fiercely resilient spirit. The story closes on the 3 of them sitting on the porch of the home they had defended and sanctified with their courage. Elias sat in a chair he had built, the small boy cradled in his lap, and Lily sat on the step beside them, her head resting against his knee. They watched the sun dip below the jagged teeth of the mountains, painting the vast, indifferent sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. There were no grand declarations, no final words needed. There was only the quiet, powerful truth of their existence, a family forged in a cruel transaction, tested by tragedy and redeemed by a love that had proven itself stronger than any darkness. They had found their justice not in a courtroom or at the end of a rope, but in the simple, hard-won piece of a life built together, a life that was finally, truly their own. Thank you for gathering around our campfire to listen to this tale. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.